With the military defeat of ISIS in the Middle East, it appears that Russia has emerged in the best position. The US and Russia appear to potentially be on a collision course in the region, but is this really the case? Joining me to discuss this is Jacob Shapiro from Austin, Texas. He's the Director of Analysis for Geopolitical Futures. Jacob, I want to get right to it. Many still view the relationship between Russia and the United States through this Cold War prism. And looking at what's happened in the Middle East, some people think that they're, in the midst of this great game there. But I guess the question is this really the case with what everything looks like today? What's your analysis?
Yeah, and it's good to be with you again, Jonathan. I think this is one of the biggest mistakes people make when thinking about the US-Russia relationship. The Cold War was about two powers, wasn't sure which one was more powerful, and they were competing all over the place across the world. The Middle East was one of the key places where the Soviet Union and the United States competed. That's just not true anymore. The United States is more powerful than Russia. There doesn't need to be any Cold War to settle who is the stronger power. The reason that Russia is in the Middle East, number one, is to build up its own image amongst its own people. It had economic problems at the time that it went into the Middle East. It had just lost Ukraine. But then the second issue for Russia is that the Middle East happens to border on a lot of different areas that are important to Russian strategic interests. So Turkey controls the Bosphorus. Both Turkey and Iran have interests in the Caucasus, where Russia has interests. Iran can also claim to spread influence into Central Asia, Afghanistan, places like that. So ultimately what we have here is not so much Russia challenging the US for hegemony. Certainly Russia likes to play the spoiler role in US policy. But beyond that, we have Russia that has defined its interests much more narrowly and is pursuing them as best it can. And honestly, Russia and the United States actually see eye to eye in some ways in what's going to happen in the future of Syria.
Interesting. Okay, why don't we rewind a little bit in time first and talk about the relationship between Russia and the U.S. under the Obama administration, because it appeared like Obama was continually uttering not threats, but at least telling Russia, what are you doing in Syria? And it seems like obviously the Trump administration, or Trump's approach personally, was the complete opposite of that. What happened under Obama, and how has it changed under Trump, or has it really changed? It's just a perception thing.
Well, I think the only thing that has really changed is that ISIS has been defeated. So the Obama administration wanted to take a position that got rid of the Assad regime. The problem was that the US couldn't find anybody to take out the Assad regime. And when ISIS began to rise, and when it began to seem like ISIS might potentially take over Damascus, that was a very real concern there in 2015, the United States had to let the Assad thing go by the wayside. That was why Obama backed away from his red line. Russia then intervened to help stabilize the Assad regime. Now, this certainly made the Obama administration look bad. It certainly made the United States look bad. But the US strategic interest was in making sure that ISIS didn't take over Syria. So what Russia was in effect doing was helping the US do its dirty work. The point there was that Russia and the US were and remain at loggerheads in Ukraine. And Russia, by demonstrating its power in the Middle East, but also its usefulness, was hoping to negotiate better terms in the relationship with Ukraine and how the US worked into that. So on the surface, the Obama administration certainly took a prestige hit with Russia going into Syria. But in what Russia actually did, which was preserve Assad, something the US couldn't do politically, and really helped defeat ISIS, it actually helped further US interests in the region.
Okay, I've seen a lot of conjecture out there about the degree to which Russia's military prowess was on display with what happened with ISIS in Syria. Is Russia really a military power, the degree to which a lot of people believe they are? Or was what happening in Syria essentially a really small sideshow when it came to real military prowess in the region?
Well, look, there are two answers to this question. Of course, Russia is a significant military power, but it is not the significant military power that everybody makes it out to be. The Russia-Georgia war showed some huge gaps in Russian abilities. And one of the things we've seen that Russia did in Syria was it has improved some of its command and control. It has proven that it can use some precision-guided munitions in effective ways. But remember, even at the height of the Russian deployment, we're talking about between 35 to 70 aircraft. By aircraft, I mean fighters and bombers and helicopters total. That was enough air support to help the Assad regime survive. But the idea that 70 aircraft is somehow a transformative force in the region, or that Russia can dictate policy or reality based on those planes, no, it couldn't do that. What it could do was it could prevent the Assad regime from falling to ISIS, which was a land-based force with no air support. So I'm impressed with the advances Russia has been able to make in terms of their air power in Syria, but despite the fact that I'm impressed, that doesn't mean that Russia is somehow some great power, or that its military powers are going to let it affect affairs in the Middle East. It just means that they've gotten a little bit better, and they weren't so good when they started.
Okay, so where do we go from here? What does the relationship between the U.S. and Russia look like, given the fact that Bashar al-Assad is still in Syria, what's happening in Israel? There's refugees all over the region, which, you know, is a tinderbox that certainly could explode. I know the Jordanians are very worried about that. Where do we go from here?
Well, the ironic thing about ISIS was it was a common enemy. So everybody was willing to let bygones be bygones and then to cooperate on defeating ISIS. ISIS is really no longer there. They've been forced to go back underground, and that actually makes the situation much more complicated for all of the players in this game, particularly for Russia. A lot of people talk about the Russia-Iran relationship being ironclad. I certainly don't see it that way, and I think you're going to start seeing Russia and Iran diverge in its interests. You're already starting to get hints of that. We've seen Russia reach out to Saudi Arabia, I think, as something of an insurance policy. Russia's problems with Turkey are well documented, all the while Russia is still maintaining an open dialogue with Israel. I think the key thing here for Russia is Russia doesn't want one power to be able to dictate affairs in the Middle East. It doesn't want Turkey to do it. It doesn't want Iran to do it. It doesn't want Saudi Arabia to do it. Ironically, that's the same thing the U.S. wants. The U.S. also wants a stable balance of power where no one country can dominate. Now, in a perfect world, Russia would be able to manage this balance in such a way that it would require the U.S. to be bogged down in the Middle East. But ultimately, if you're thinking about Russia's geopolitical interest in the long term, it's making sure that no one power can dominate the Middle East and then start to threaten in or encroach upon Russian areas or spheres of influence that they think are part of their own sphere of influence. So I think long term here, what you're looking at is that ironically, Russia and the United States see eye to eye in the Middle East. I don't think anybody would ever announce that. I don't think there'll be a press conference announcing that there's official cooperation, but they're already coordinating their forces. And I think that in the long term, their interests actually go more in the same direction than any of the other relationships Russia has right now in the region.
Well, okay, that's super interesting. One final question that I want to tackle here. You already mentioned it. And you talk about the fact that Russia and Iran may actually see their interests diverging to a certain extent. How is that going to manifest, and how is that going to tie into what the U.S. sees for Iran's relationships in the region over the next few years?
Well, I think we're already beginning to see it manifest. There are reports coming out of Syria that Syria may have blocked some Iranian goods from coming into the country. There are unconfirmed reports out there that Netanyahu and Assad have come to some understanding that was brokered by Putin, and we know that the Russians have been talking to the Israelis constantly. Look, ultimately, Syria for Iran is about Iran's attempt to try and dominate the Middle East. Russia would like to save the Assad regime. Russia would like to preserve its position in the Middle East. It does not want to see Iran dominate the Middle East. So I think the point at which this is going to diverge is that if Iran really becomes ascendant, and if it looks like massive numbers of Iranian troops, for example, are in Syria and are dictating policy, I think you're going to see Russia try and move around and try and move support maybe to Saudi Arabia, maybe to Turkey, maybe even working more openly with the United States. That's the fault line.
Fascinating times. I don't think anyone would have predicted this even 2 or 3 years ago. Thank you so much for your time, Jacob.
Thanks, Jonathan.